Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the 66th session of LUMS Live and to the Political Economy of Development series hosted by the Mehboob Haq Research Center here at LUMS. It gives me great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. We are here to essentially for a launch event for a recently published edited volume that looks at Pakistan's political parties. It's titled Pakistan's Political Parties, Surviving Between Democracy, a Dictatorship and Democracy, published by Folio Books in Pakistan and by Georgetown University Press outside of Pakistan. It's been edited by Dr. Mariam Mufti, Dr. Sahar Shafkat, and Dr. Niloufar Siddiqui, and we're very happy that one of the co-editors of this volume are joining us today, as well as two of the contributors to this volume, Dr. Sarah Khan and Dr. Asad Liaqat. My name is Umair Javed. I'm an assistant professor in politics and sociology here at LUMS. I'll just very briefly introduce the panelists that we have for today. Firstly, Mariam Mufti, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She studies the politics of hybrid regimes with a particular focus on the role of the military, political parties, and identity in the processes of recruitment and selection of the political elite in Pakistan. She has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. As I previously mentioned, she's one of the co-editors of this particular volume. Joining us as well is one of the contributors to the volume, Dr. Sarah Khan, who is an assistant professor at Yale, and she researches gender and comparative politics with a regional specialization in South Asia. In her work, she studies gender gaps in political preferences and the barriers to women's political participation and representation. She also researches strategies to prevent and address violence against women in the developing world. She has a PhD in political science from Columbia University. And finally, our third panelist and another contributor to this volume is Dr. Asad Liaqat. Asad is a research scientist at Facebook, where he works on financial inclusion and digital currencies. His research and policy work has focused on political accountability, women's political participation, political decision-making, and related topics. Asad has a PhD in public policy from Harvard University. Thank you to all three of you for joining us for this session today. So I'm going to very briefly, so the format of the session is that I'm going to give some brief introductory remarks about the book itself, and obviously why it's important, why everyone should actually read it, and especially for those who have an academic interest in the politics of South Asia and of Pakistan more categorically. But I think it's also for general readers who are just interested in the country as a whole. I think it really sort of makes an important contribution to our understanding of how politics and society more broadly functions in Pakistan as a whole, right? So there are a number of reasons, theoretically speaking, why it's important to study political parties, in this context or in any other context, right? Because as the saying goes, that political parties help structure what we call as the political world for both aspiring politicians and for citizens, right? They help in what we call interest representation. They help in political inclusion, policy formation, and other processes of governance as a whole. But in Pakistan's context, I feel like it's even more important to study political parties because of the lack of attention that's generally been paid to them, and because of the lack of attention that's generally paid to the dynamics of political parties within the political sphere and within obviously the way that Pakistan society actually functions. Historically and sort of conventionally, most of the academic literature on Pakistan and Pakistani domestic politics has tended to focus on institutional conflicts, civil military relations, the judiciary, and there's very little attention that's been paid to the substantive differences in organizational structures within the realm within the political sphere as a whole. So questions that need to be asked and questions that should be sort of deliberated further upon include: how do parties adapt to constraints that have been imposed by the particular nature of Pakistan's political system, right? How do parties rework those particular constraints? I think for too long, political parties in Pakistan have been treated or have been reduced to sort of either groups of elites who engage in situational strategic dynamics within the constraints that they encounter. And that I feel is doing a disservice to both the dynamism of domestic politics in Pakistan and also to the general longevity of political parties as an institution, as institutions in this country. And I feel like it makes sense for us to focus on some of the organizational aspects that mediate between political agents on one end and obviously structural factors and institutional constraints on the other. So with that introduction, I want to turn to Dr. Mariam Mufti, who is, as I previously mentioned, the co-editor of this volume, to talk a little bit about what drove the sort of coming together for this particular volume, what were the factors that went into it, and what she thinks are some of the sort of standout contributions that this volume makes to the study of Pakistani politics.
Thank you, Umair. Thank you to the Mehboob ul Haq Research Center for organizing this event. I'm very excited to speak about our volume on Pakistan's political parties on behalf of my co-editors, Dr. Neelufar Siddiqui and Dr. Sahar Shafkat. I'm also very happy to see two of our contributors here speaking about their chapters. Really, what I want to do in my very brief remarks introducing this volume is to talk about the impetus for it and and how we came upon writing this volume together. Basically, it stemmed from a belief that insufficient attention has been paid to political parties when trying to understand Pakistani politics from either a scholarly or policy perspective. And as Dr. Javed just very nicely laid out for us, political parties have indeed been ignored for a long time. When studying Pakistan, we tend to focus on the military as an institution, and we tend to focus on the unbalanced civil-military relationship to explain Pakistan's circuitous relationship with democracy. And so therefore, we felt that it was really important to pay attention to these actors, these long-standing actors in Pakistan's political arena that have had a tremendous impact on Pakistan's relationship with democracy. Now, as we know, since independence in 1947, Pakistan has undergone 4 tumultuous military coups, ratified 3 constitutions that have swayed the institutional setup in the country from presidential to parliamentary politics, held 10 general elections, not to mention many provincial and local electoral contests as well. Now, in 2013, we saw the first transfer of power from one civilian government to another. In 2018, this exercise was repeated with the election of Imran Khan as the head of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. But we are yet to see if a prime minister can actually successfully complete their full term. And given the Senate elections that have just recently taken place, I mean, we have to question whether the PTI's performance is something that is causing it to perhaps lose ground in the Pakistani institutional setup. Of course, it is important to understand the military and the range of tactics that it has employed over the years to manipulate the political arena. However, it is our contention that political parties matter equally or maybe even more. First of all, political parties in Pakistan have been vehicles to elect democratic governments in the country. And also the way political parties have functioned in Pakistan has raised vital questions about representation, capacity for policy making and implementation. In Pakistan, the weakness of political parties, not least because of the military's interventions, but also because of how these political parties have structured and organized and functioned in Pakistan's democracy, has had tremendous consequences. For one thing, we see that party labels really do matter in Pakistan, whether you vote for the PMLN, the PPP, the MQM, the ANP, and numerous other political parties, the Islamist political parties for that matter, party labels do matter. What these political parties stand for matter. If the labels didn't matter, activists in political parties wouldn't bother to actually join political parties and work for political parties and campaign for political parties. Similarly, political parties, we know, order legislative life. After all, the representatives of these political parties are seated in the National Assembly and the Senate, and they are the ones responsible for deliberating over legislation. Now, to what extent this legislation has an impact once implemented is a separate question, but the fact of the matter is that political parties are setting the political discourse in the country. Finally, party competition, especially when it spills over onto the streets, as we have seen in the numerous dharnas, the long marches and oppositional movements, the PDM, for example, and their politics currently has significantly shaped Pakistan's social fabric as well. So the point that I'm generally trying to make, and it's reiterating what we started off this discussion with, is that political parties really matter. they have been ignored in the scholarly discourse, and we felt that it was necessary to pay attention to how political parties have actually shaped Pakistan's politics in the last few years. The second point that I want to make about the volume is that it highlights three key research areas related to party politics in Pakistan. The first is form. What makes up the party system in Pakistan? Which political parties are part of the party system? Which ones are significant? Which ones have coalition potential? Which ones have bargaining potential? Which political parties successfully form the government, and why and how? The second is function. What purpose do these political parties serve in a hybrid political context? And when I speak of a hybrid political context, I'm talking about the tutelary influence of the military in Pakistani politics. So what exactly are these political parties doing? If these political parties are deeply affected by the unbalanced civil-military relations in Pakistan, then how exactly are these political parties performing? What functions do these parties serve in terms of selecting candidates, in terms of recruiting members to parliament, in terms of how they appeal to voters, and so forth? So this is the second key area of research. The third is survival. How do political parties respond to crises of legitimacy and challenges from the so-called establishment in Pakistan? And here, not only are we focusing on the relationship of political parties to the military, to the judiciary, but also to oppositional movements in the country. The third most important aspect, I think, that is being highlighted by this book is the continuity and transformation that has occurred in Pakistan's political arena. And I want to mention four such influences. The first, of course, being the effect of globalization. Second, the growing population. Third, urbanization. And fourth, the modernizing civil and social discourse. And here I think Dr. Sarah Khan and Dr. Asad Liaqat's chapters are really, really significant. With these major social transformations that have occurred in Pakistan, we want to question how political parties have actually responded to these changes. So we've seen tremendous amount of continuity in Pakistan's politics. For instance, the role of Biradri and local electables still continues to hold sway in Pakistani politics. But the Pakistani voter has indeed become a little bit more educated, a little bit more informed, and the choices that they are now making are significantly different from what they were making in the 1950s, 1960s. Furthermore, a more modernizing society in Pakistan, where women are stepping forward into the political foreground, of course, is also now impacting Pakistan's political fabric. And I think the two chapters that we're discussing over here today by Dr. Liaqat and by Dr. Khan are extremely informative. I do want to end with an important point about the methodological diversity that this book represents. We wanted to foreground research that is being done in Pakistan on political parties in particular that is rigorous, that is based on field research. We have focused on the multidisciplinary methodological approaches that many of these chapters represent. For example, the semi-structured interviews using surveys, ethnography, and so on. I think this is really important because for a long time, the idea that it was difficult to do research in Pakistan because of the lack of transparency, due to the corruption in institutional processes, due to the lack of good quality data, that we couldn't really make parsimonious, theoretical, informed, present parsimonious, theoretical, informed understandings of Pakistani politics. And we wanted to change that impression about Pakistani about the research that's being done on Pakistan. And I think these chapters in this volume actually do show and represent the new research that is now being done and is, of course, highlighting the current work of many academics around the world. So with that, I think we should jump into the chapters.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mariam Mufti. So before we get into the actual sort of the discussion on the chapters and the comment from the contributors themselves. I just want to focus on this one aspect that Dr. Mufti also highlighted, which is that this book deals with several sub-themes within sort of political party life in Pakistan. And one of those sub-themes is obviously the functions and the functional aspects of what of political parties in this country. And it's interesting that all three of our contributors, and obviously Mariam as the co-editor here, deal with three specific aspects of these of political party function. So Sarah's work looks at inclusion and representation. Asad and his co-authors' work looks at mobilization and engagement, and then Mariam and Asad Javed's work looks at elite recruitment and party affiliation. So I think there's an interesting diversity that allows us to cover several sort of key aspects of what political parties are actually doing in this country, and I think that it gains a significant amount of precedence given what has recently transpired in Pakistan with the Senate election. And I'll sort of turn to Dr. Sarah Khan, so she could sort of delve a little deeper into her work on gender and political representation and the role of political parties in Pakistan. But before that, I just want to add that I taught one of Sarah's working papers today for a class, and I was sort of astonished by some of the responses that I got from my students, that there's considerable lack of clarity on where gender and political representation actually stands currently in Pakistan, especially differences between urban and rural areas. So I know that's not what you've directly addressed in this particular chapter, but I certainly look forward to hearing your comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I want to say thanks to both the panel organizers and the editors for making space in this event and in the volume to explore the question of women in electoral politics, especially when the actual space for women in electoral politics in Pakistan is incredibly limited. So the goal of the chapter I see as threefold. First is to provide a picture of women's systematic marginalization in Pakistan's electoral politics, and to do so drawing on different sources of data, including administrative data as well as survey-based data. And in painting this picture, call into question the quality and health of a democracy where half of the population is de facto excluded from electoral contestation and competition. The second goal is to provide sort of an organizing framework that can hopefully be helpful for scholars as well as policymakers to think about the various channels and how they interact to perpetuate this exclusion. So I highlight the role of parties, of institutions, of voters, and of families. And finally, I wanted to slightly reframe the way in which we think about the role of two paths towards women's representation. And these paths are quotas or reserved seats and dynastic connections. So I'll use my time to briefly touch on these topics, and then I hope we can use the Q&A to get in depth into some of the themes. So just by way of background, my past work has focused on the persisting gender gaps in voter turnout in Pakistan over the course of multiple elections. So just prior to the 2018 election, Dr. Ali Chima, Dr. Shandana Khan Momand, Dr. Asad Liaqat and I conducted a survey of 2,500 households in Lahore. And in this, we found that 90% of our respondents agreed that it was appropriate for women to cast votes in the upcoming election. But when it comes to even discussing politics in the home, only 70% of men and 80% of women think that it's appropriate for women to do this. And when it comes to standing for elections or becoming party workers, the numbers are 35% of men and 60% of women thinking that this is an appropriate act for women to engage in. So while the consensus around women's right to vote certainly isn't shared universally across Pakistan, I think we can agree that there's relative agreement that it's acceptable and even important for women to vote. But it's less acceptable for them to actually have an independent opinion about who to vote for or to stand as candidates or work as party workers themselves. And we can think about this in part by referring to parties' strategic incentives. So in increasingly competitive elections, parties need women's votes, but they have little to no incentive to nominate women as candidates or to recruit them into party networks as workers. So in the introduction of the book, the editors classify Pakistan's parties into mainstream ethnic and religious parties. And what's remarkable to me is that across parties that draw support from different social groups, have different ideological commitments, they look remarkably similar on one dimension, which is the proportion of women they nominate to general seats for provincial and national assemblies. So this is a metric on which all parties are within about 2 percentage points of each other. So in 2018, women accounted for 5 to 7% of any given party's candidate pool. And this 5% was in part a result of a minimum requirement instituted in the 2017 Election Act for the first time. We can talk about this more maybe in Q&A. So why is this, right? So in the volume, in their chapter, Dr. Mufti and Dr. Asad Javed talk about parties' increasing reliance on electables. And I think what's important to note is that women are not perceived as electable, which makes them risky candidates. And this is where voters enter the picture as well. So a nationally representative survey in Pakistan showed that more than 70% of Pakistanis agree with the statement that on the whole, men make better leaders than women. So women are a risky bet for parties, and this risk is exacerbated in a first-past-the-post, winner-take-all electoral system. So cross-national comparisons tell us that women are more likely to be nominated and elected in democracies with proportional rather than majoritarian systems of representation. But within majoritarian systems of representation, this exclusion is also exacerbated by high levels of competition. So something that we see as a marker of a healthy democracy, increased competitiveness, is also a feature that contributes to women's marginalization, because the more competitive an election is, the more risky it is to run with a candidate where there's some uncertainty about their electability. So the persisting solution to this systematic underrepresentation has been quotas for women. Pakistan's quotas are designed in a way that corrects for women's underrepresentation by adding on seats in assemblies where women are indirectly elected in proportion to the seats directly won by parties in general elections. And for years, women's rights activists and groups have been pointing out how this design deprives women of connections to a constituency. And I'm happy to kind of talk more in Q&A about how this design fails to achieve the ultimate goal of quotas, which is that one day these quotas should in fact be redundant. But this design also betrays an unwillingness to see the problem as just one of women's underrepresentation, rather than of men's overrepresentation in a democratic body. So if we were to frame the problem as men's overrepresentation, the solution would then be to reserve a proportion of general seats, or a rule that required parties to have women as a proportion of the tickets that they allocate in an election. Just yesterday, a sitting senator inadvertently referred to the general Senate seat from Islamabad as the men's seat. And I don't want to single this senator out, because I think he just said the quiet part out loud. And so I hope we can kind of have a conversation about why this particular design of quotas doesn't in fact achieve the ultimate goal of making quotas redundant. So finally, who are the women who ascend to political power in Pakistan? Various authors in the volume have referred to the prevalence of dynastic candidates within Pakistan's political landscape. And I want to highlight that dynastic linkages provide a gendered advantage. So in 2008, more than a third of contesting male candidates for national and provincial assemblies were ones who had political family connections. For women candidates, this proportion was more like 70%. And this is only magnified in those who are actually elected, because such connections provide an electoral advantage to winning. And when we think about the dynastic label, it's often used to discredit the women who come into power. And I want to ask a different question, which is, why is it that familial and dynastic connections are necessary for women's entry into politics, so much more so than they are for men? So I think I'll leave it there on that question, and then we can pick up on more of these themes. And I think they connect nicely to the chapter by Dr. Liaqat, Dr. Mohammed, and Dr. Shima as well.
Thanks so much for that overview, Sarah, and for posing these questions, which are, I think, central. And to sort of to your point about the senator referring to the general seat as a bench seat, I quickly went over the numbers on the Senate of Pakistan's website, and it turns out that throughout Pakistan's history, we've only had 14 women ever elected on general seats in over 50 years. And there have been none in this particular round of the Senate election, right? The last person to serve on a general seat was Shari Rehman, who was actually sort of finishing off the term for a senator who no longer held office at some point. So the state of affairs, as you've rightly pointed out, is fairly bleak, and there are sort of all sorts of questions that these throw up as far as obviously the structure of domestic politics in Pakistan is concerned. So I'm going to turn to the second function that we've spoken about, which is mobilization and engagement. And specifically to Dr. Asad Liaqat's work with Ali Chima and Jandana Khan Mohammad, which is the chapter is titled "Who Do Politicians Talk to? Political Contact in Urban Punjab." And I think one of the things that I found sort of very interesting reading this chapter, and obviously the work that it builds on, is that we have a lot of preconceived notions of how politicians and political parties actually go about doing their work. And some of those preconceived notions might not actually hold when you sort of put them under empirical scrutiny of some sort. So here to sort of rectify some long-standing perhaps myths about the way that political parties function is Asad Liaqat. Asad, floor is yours.
Thank you, Umair, and the organizers for having me, and thanks, of course, to the editors, Dr. Mariam Mufti, Shafqat, and Niloufar Siddiqui for envisioning the book and making it happen. I'm going to talk about my chapter with Dr. Ali Chima and Jandana Mohammad on political contact in urban Punjab. And within the context of this book, our chapter aims to shed light on, as Umair mentioned, one of the primary functions that political parties play, which is engaging with citizens. But from the perspective of how political engagement ultimately matters for representation. In a well-functioning democracy, we think that voters elect politicians so that they can represent their interests. And I want to be a bit clearer about what we mean by representation, right? So in that we can contrast two different types of representation. So you could think about what's called a trustee model, in which once a politician is elected, they're empowered to make decisions on citizens' behalf, even if they're not precisely the kinds of decisions that citizens want them to make. And there's a separate delegate model that's a different way of thinking about representation, in which politicians must actually act strictly in accordance with the beliefs of constituents who elect them, right? So in a trustee model, you actually don't need citizens to tell politicians what they want. They know better, right? So then political engagement in such a context would serve a very limited purpose, a different kind of purpose. In a delegate model, though, once a politician is elected, they're supposed to provide their citizens exactly what they want. And for that to happen, the politicians must, in the first place, know what it is that citizens prefer. So what model do citizens actually want politicians to follow in Pakistan? And what model do politicians claim to aspire towards? So we decided to take this question to the voters and politicians themselves. So we took a sample of both voters and local politicians in Lahore, and we asked the citizens, well, what kind of politician do you want? And we asked the politicians, what kind of politician do you think you are? What kind of politician do you want to be? And overwhelmingly, both of them supported the delegate model, which is to say that both citizens and politicians said that politicians ought to do what citizens want them to do, and they should not be making decisions of their own accord against the will of citizens, right? So this is to say that we don't have the kind of politicians who think they know, or at least they claim that they know better. They actually claim that they actually want to find out what citizens want and give them what they want. Okay, so that's great. Citizens and politicians agree on what model of representation they want to follow. But at this point, we're forced to ask, to what extent are the politicians actually succeeding in acting as delegates? And to what extent are citizens getting the kind of representative that they actually want? So in order for any of this to happen, the very first ingredient that needs to be in place is for politicians to actually know what citizens want. And to figure out whether politicians know this, we must examine the structure of political engagement and contact at a very local level. So what are the ways in which politicians engage with citizens? Is political contact allowing politicians to represent the views of citizens? Or is there something about political contact that actually causes bias and may be detrimental to the interests of citizens or certain kinds of citizens? So to examine some of these issues, we focus on local politics at the union council or ward level, where these local elected politicians, such as union council chairpersons or ward members or women councillors or unelected local brokers, are engaging with citizens in a number of ways. So we do a survey of more than 2,000 voters in 43 union councils in the heart of Lahore. This is a slightly different survey from the one that Sarah just mentioned. And we do interviews or surveys with nearly 100 kind of local or higher tier politicians to get insights on these questions. So what are the main types of political contact that exist? Based on our fieldwork, we kind of categorize and focus on three main types. The first is door-to-door election campaigning. The second is voter-initiated contact outside of elections, kind of more day-to-day problem solving. And the third is kind of more informal politicians knowing citizens personally. And I'll briefly touch upon each of these now. So for the first kind of the election door-to-door campaigning, when these political campaign workers in an election campaign go door to door, there are actually pretty meaningful interactions here. So lots and lots of voters and politicians have told us that this is actually a time when the visiting worker or the visiting politician who's coming to their door to ask for their vote actually has to hear the voter out. They have no option but to hear all of the complaints because they're ultimately asking for their vote in a few days. Interestingly, the higher tier leaders, the MNA or the MPA candidates who are contesting these elections, their claim is that we try and go visit every single door in our constituency. Now, of course, they ask a bunch of workers to do this, and of course, like in any organization, there's some amount of shirking. So when we asked voters, on average, about 30% of households said that somebody came and talked to us at election time. Now, do these workers end up selecting these kind of 30% at random? No. So there's some evidence on targeting based on income and education. So these workers are actually electing to go to the less educated and the less well-off in terms of which households we go to. So that's probably not a bad outcome if we think that the views of these groups are typically underrepresented in politics. But when we look within the households, we find that the women are much less likely to talk directly with the visiting worker, partly because women workers are much less likely to visit these households, or to even know that somebody came to their house, right? So in these engagements, women are going to be underrepresented. Surprisingly, we find, kind of contrary to the literature, that these campaign visits are not targeted by partisan status. So you would think that the most likely to be targeted would either be undecided voters, right? So that the party can convince them to vote, to come on and vote for the party to switch, or kind of their own party voters to encourage them to turn out. So on the one hand, this may be a good story for the transmission of information from different quarters, but on the other hand, this also suggests that these workers maybe don't know enough about the voters to be able to target them, and that probably is not a good sign for representation. So the second type is outside of election cycles, voter-initiated contact for the purposes of problem solving. And so this is also fairly common, more common than sometimes we realize. So in each union council that we visited in Lahore, there are these union councils set up. These politicians often sit here. In some of these offices, the phone numbers of councillors and politicians are written up. You can call them up, ask them whether they're in the office, and come talk to them about these issues. So in our sample of local politicians, they talk to an average of about 38 citizens a week, and about 70% of which are men. So when we ask voters, we find kind of a similar pattern in terms of the gender divide. So again, here men are fairly overrepresented. Interestingly, here we also find a partisan divide, but not in the precise way that you might expect. Undecided voters are actually more likely to contact politicians from both the PMLN and the PTI in our sample, compared to partisan voters. But the partisan voters only talk to the politicians from their own party. So what this is going to tell you is that the PMLN politicians are going to only hear from their own party supporters or undecided voters. They're never going to hear from the PTI voters, and vice versa. The third type of contact or closeness, and perhaps this is potentially the most powerful, is knowing someone personally. Hum kisi ko zati taur par jante hain. And the local politicians' claim to fame within their party hierarchy is really based on this. And the claim is that we're so deeply embedded in the communities we represent that we literally know everyone. And the typical quote that we hear from a local councillor or UC chairperson is, take me to any house in my union council and I can tell just by looking at the door who lives there and who they vote for. On the contrary, we find that only 11% of voters say that their union council chairperson or their councillor knows them or knows them very well. You would think that they would have a pretty good idea of this. And the vast majority states that actually they don't know them at all. And this number is very similar for union councillor and kind of chairperson levels. So what kind of citizens are these select few? Here we see kind of by far the most elite bias. This means that kind of outside of the 5 or so people that go see a politician every day, the type of people that they're surrounded with, whose weddings and funerals they go to, who they talk to on a regular basis, are overwhelmingly from their own party. They're rich in the local context, and they're men. So the key takeaway here is that if politicians are forming their beliefs about what citizens want through these interactions, they're going to reflect all these biases that I've outlined, since those who are in contact with politicians are markedly different from the average voter. Now, does this contact matter? In other work, I show that these politicians' beliefs are actually pretty inaccurate, and that these beliefs really matter for the kind of decision these politicians end up taking. So this contact really matters for representation ultimately. So finally, looking forward, what can we expect about the state of political contact going forward? What is the current state of democracy and the lack of continuity in local government mean for representation? And here one would think that with democratic continuity, there would be a greater incentive for politicians to remove these biases. And with, if we had a more stable local government system, we might start seeing local politicians having contact with a broader segment of the population with time. Unfortunately, due to the dismissal of the local governments in Punjab and kind of the unpredictable changes around the local government system and the delays in holding new elections, we're ending up disempowering this local tier of political machinery and kind of taking a lot of the substance out of local political contact. And ultimately, I think this is going to hamper the ability of local politicians to represent their citizens in a meaningful way, and will also prevent politicians at a higher tier level within parties, the MP, MNA level, to learn more about their citizens. I'll end here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Asad. Some really interesting data that's coming out from all this new work that's happening here. I already have a couple of questions for Sarah and Asad, which I'll sort of come to later. But I just wanted to turn to Dr. Mariam Mufti and her chapter co-authored with Dr. Asad Liaqat on candidate party linkages in Pakistan. It's titled, the title is Candidate Party Linkages in Pakistan. Why do candidates stick with losing parties? And I it would be great if we could hear something about, about the nature of these linkages, and also whether it's sort of, common conceptions of political parties as groups of politicians who sway from one end to the other, depending on who's in power, or, where sort of they get a particular type of incentive of some sort. So really, what does explain the stickiness in terms of who gets to stick around with political parties, even in instances where they may not have direct access to government power? Sorry, Mariam, you're on mute.
So I wrote this chapter with Dr. Asad Javed, and both of us in our respective research have made two observations about Pakistani politics. The first is that voters typically tend to support candidates and political parties on the basis of their ability to provide and dispense patronage, as opposed to ideology or even policy perspectives. The second observation, of course, is that political parties, especially the larger catch-all political parties like the Pakistan People's Party, the PMLN, the PTI, political parties that have been electorally successful in Pakistan's political system, have tend to select candidates who are otherwise known as electables or have a lot of influence, local influence within their own constituencies. And stemming from these two observations, we started thinking about what exactly is the role of political parties in the electoral process. Is the role simply to provide a platform for these so-called electable politicians to contest an election and get access to the levers of state patronage? Or is the function of a political party more so than that, which is to actually provide a party label and provide voters with information about what these potential electables actually stand for? So that is what we were questioning. But when we started thinking about the chapter and doing the research for this chapter, the more interesting story was not so much from the party-centered approach, but also from the candidate-centered approach. So who exactly these candidates are, where are they coming from, what exactly are their sources of political power within their constituencies, and more so, why are these candidates sometimes sticking to political parties that are not winning the election? Because we know that there's a lot of at least we've observed a lot of party switching that goes on prior to an election in the Pakistani political system. And this is interesting because usually party switching in the way that has been studied in the literature generally has been legislative party switching, where politicians tend to change their perspectives, their ideological perspectives on legislation within the parliament, as opposed to switching political parties between elections, right? And in that, I think Pakistan provides a really, really neat, a really neat example of how exactly politicians think of their role within their respective political parties. Now, I want to start off with an example from NA 67 in Sargodha. And this is a constituency in central Punjab where voters have consistently voted in Anwar Ali Chima, a candidate who first belonged to the Pakistan Muslim League, then to the Islami Jamhuri Ittihad, the IJI, and then to PMLN, and then eventually to the PMLQ. This is a candidate who has not lost a single election since 1985. He's won consistently. But in 2013, he lost. He contested from the platform of the Pakistan Muslim League Qaid, which is the PMLQ, a party that was led by Pervez Elahi and Shajat Hussain. And then, and he did not, unlike all of his other contemporaries, switch to the PMLN, which is the political party that eventually won in 2013. So the question is, what exactly happened here? This is a man who hasn't lost a single election in his entire political career. Why did he, number one, stick to the PMLQ when he knew that PMLQ would not be the party that would form the electoral government? Second, why is it that voters did not vote for Anwar Ali Chima when they know that this is a politician, an electable politician who has consistently won every single election, and an individual who was known for his honesty, his integrity, a good leader, so to speak, amongst the voters? Why did they not choose to vote for him and instead vote for an unknown candidate, Zulfikar Bhatti from PMLN, who had previously never really had a successful electoral performance? So these were some of the questions that prompted us to write this chapter. And there's a number of things that we're trying to achieve in this chapter. It was a very ambitious chapter, but let me just shed some light very quickly on the two approaches that we took to understanding these candidate party linkages. The first thing we did was create a typology. We categorized electoral candidates along 4 types based on their levels of autonomy and commitment to the party. The party heavyweight, so an individual like Anwar Ali Chima, a party heavyweight not just because of his local influence due to land and other independent sources of power, but a party heavyweight because he had successfully competed in elections and performed extremely well for his political party, no matter which one he had contested from. The second is the independent electable. The independent electable has very, very high sources of autonomy and very, very low commitments to a political party. This is a candidate who switches political parties from election to election to election. And if you carefully observe how exactly these independent electables move, you will notice that they will often contest as independent candidates. Once a political party is elected and has formed the government, they will switch to that political party. So this is a candidate that is not necessarily changing political parties between elections, but is changing political parties once the party government has formed. The third is the party worker. This is a candidate with very high levels of commitment to the political party. This is an individual who's an activist. This is the individual you will see out with the candidate, campaigning for the political party, contesting for the political party, shouting out the party slogans, and so forth. And then you've got, of course, the aspirational candidate. This is a candidate who thinks of politics as a way to advance his status. This is a candidate who might think of politics as a stepping stone to some other kind of social success. Now, this was the candidate-centered approach. The party-centered approach sheds light on which of these candidates is most frequently recruited by political parties to contest elections on the party's behalf. We find that the larger and more electorally successful parties like the PPP, PMLN, and PTI select candidates who have typically displayed high levels of autonomy and low levels of commitment to the party. while smaller political parties like the MQM, the Awami National Party, ANP, or the Jamaat-e-Islami select candidates with high levels of commitment to the party. They instead are prioritizing the candidate's party affiliation, how long, whether or not the candidate has had a long-standing relationship with the political party, has actually done party work. And what we found was that the intersection of the supply of candidates with the demand for autonomous politicians who have independent sources of power results in undisciplined political parties that are unable to elicit credible commitment from their politicians. Now, this is important. Political parties like PPP, PMLN, and PTI have often chosen these autonomous politicians who have independent sources of power. Why would these politicians then be loyal to these political parties from one electoral term to another, right? And so what we've ended up with in Pakistan are these really, really electorally successful political parties, but political parties that are actually very undisciplined. Now, why should this lack of discipline matter to Pakistani politics? Well, it matters because these are political parties that, first of all, cannot rely on an incumbent advantage from one election to the next. So the Pakistan Muslim League lost a number of its members to the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. The PMLQ previously lost a number of its members to the Pakistan Muslim League and to the PPP, which is why the PPP won in 2008 and then PMLN won in 2013. And so we do not necessarily see continuity of governance by one political party. Now, the hallmark of democracy, of course, is alternation of power and transfer of power from one party to the next. But at the same time, if the alternation of power is actually occurring because the politicians are switching party seats, are switching political parties, well, that's a different dynamic altogether. And that is what we were trying to shed light on. Now, while some candidates switch party affiliation prior to an election in the quest for the right party ticket, the political party that is going to form government and therefore give them access to state patronage, we have also seen that several candidates choose to remain loyal to their political parties. And the question is, why did Anwar Ali Cheema, who had switched political parties from one to another, throughout his political career, choose to stay with the PMLQ in 2013 when the PMLQ was at its lowest in terms of party influence? Well, it's interesting to note that Anwar Ali Cheema is related to Chaudhry Parvez Elahi and Chaudhry Shujat Hussain, who are the leaders of the political party, related by marriage. So is it that political parties are able to retain the loyalty of certain members of the party by promising prestigious political appointments to the cabinet, or by promising access to state patronage, by promising, the approval of developmental schemes and so on and so forth? Or are they actually eliciting loyalty from their candidates at a much more deeper level, which is perhaps a kinship network, a dynastic relationship, or even a bond that is being created through marriage, the marriage of their children, and so forth? Is it that political parties are also managing to retain the loyalty of party workers by party members by actually due to some historical, ideological connection that the political party might have elicited from its members? For example, the PPP, we often hear of this culture of jialas, right? Now, is it that certain PPP members have stayed loyal to the Pakistan People's Party because they feel that ideological affinity? Or is it because they know that in Sindh, the only political party, especially in the interior of Sindh, that is likely to win is the Pakistan People's Party? So if you want access to the provincial party that's going to form the government, then you may as well stick to that party ticket. So the question that we're really posing is, how are candidates thinking about this? And simultaneously, how are political parties thinking about this? These are all strategic decisions that are being made on both ends. And therefore, we think that that supply-demand framework that we try to present, the candidate-centered approach and the party-centered approach, is actually an interesting one. The last thing that I do also want to mention is how candidates often exhibit loyalty regardless of electoral outcome. There are candidates that don't think about the electoral outcome at all because they realize that elections are not a one-off game. political parties in Pakistan have been so deeply manipulated by the so-called establishment that the so-called incumbency advantage has not typically existed in Pakistan. In fact, being the incumbent party has often been a disadvantage for political parties. And I think that candidates also realize that, okay, if the party doesn't make it in the next election, well, they are going to come back in the election after that, right? It's not a one-off game. And so therefore, sticking close to the party leadership, showing your so-called loyalty to the party leadership might actually reap the benefits later on when the political party is back in power. So these were some of the dynamics that we discussed in our chapter. And of course, I'm happy to talk more about them in the question answer session. I will say that writing this chapter was a pleasure, and then reading Asad's chapter was even more interesting because it talks about the story from the perspective of the voter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mariam, and for really laying out the dynamics that center around both the party's sort of position on candidate recruitment, but also the kind of strategic decision making that candidates engage in. So I have a couple of questions actually that were posed to me by people who are watching this live stream. So I have a couple for Sara initially, and then there's one for Asad Liaqat, which actually comes from a politician, and it's of a prescriptive nature of sorts. So for Sara, our colleague Samuel Asim at the economics department has essentially, what he's asking is given that the perceived risks of success as far as women politicians are concerned and women as candidates are concerned, do you think that there is, does that contribute to the lack of support within households for women, who are working as political workers? Because potentially the sort of the trade-offs of them sort of giving up existing employment or giving up the existing sort of work that they do as especially in rural areas as sort of labor, that obviously that's a higher trade-off if they were to sort of join politics full time. So that's the first question. And the second one is how do parties themselves consider these quotas that already exist, or do you think that these quotas now sort of also act as a ceiling on the limit of participation that women might have within the political sphere?
Yeah, thank you. So those are both great questions. And first to Samuel's question, I think there's a parallel here in the way we can think about the supply of women as candidates and party workers, and how we can think about women's participation in the labor force in Pakistan more broadly, right? And so in both cases, there's this trade-off of what is the opportunity cost to the alternate use of women's time. And I think to understand this, it's important to consider just how strong the norms around the gendered division of labor within the household are. And this is not particular to Pakistan. I think these norms are inflexible in many, many contexts. And so certainly these inflexible norms around who can do household labor, who can do childcare, make it difficult for women to participate in the labor force and politics more broadly. But I think when we're thinking about politics, the costs of women participating are increased by the very public nature of political life. And so here we can think about, it was really interesting to hear Mariam talk about the ways in which there are aspirational candidates who seek status from contesting. And in stark contrast to this, when women contest elections or step into public life in any way, there's a cost that comes from the gendered violence and harassment that goes along with being in public life when there's a strong norm against women's presence in public life. So, I mean, I don't think this is a full answer to the question, but I think thinking about these opportunity costs as well as the particular costs that women face in the political sphere is a really nice way to think about the supply of women candidates and workers. On the question of quotas, I think the 2018 election is actually a really interesting situation to think about this, because it's the first time that in addition to these reserved seats, parties were required to have to field 5% of women candidates as a proportion of their total pool for provincial and national assemblies. And what we saw here was that parties met this minimum, but just barely. And simultaneously, complaints from women candidates that they were being fielded in uncompetitive constituencies. So in 2018, 4.5% of all women candidates who contested general elections won seats, while 8.7% of male candidates did. And we can think of this as being driven by the electoral disadvantage that women may face with voters, but it's also in part because parties disproportionately fielded women candidates from constituencies where the party is uncompetitive. And I think here the reserve seats may have served as a sort of safety valve for allowing parties to field their strongest women candidates from uncompetitive constituencies, with the idea that if they lose, they can be given a reserved seat. So there was an overlap in the lists of women drawn up for reserved seats and the ones who were contested. So I think it's important to think about how these two institutions can kind of work together. And in fact, what we might think of as an additional policy to improve women's representation sort of didn't work out that way because of the way in which it interacts with the quota.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Sarah. To Asad, there's this is a two-part question. The first is methodological in nature. So I guess if you could, very briefly speak about the sort of the applicability of what you've sort of uncovered in your work in Lahore to other contexts, other urban contexts in Punjab more broadly, maybe in other parts of Pakistan. And then the substantive part of this question relates to sort of a more prescriptive nature. That what lessons do you think politicians can draw, or parties as institutions could draw on improving contact with voters, so that they are better able to capture preferences and are able to sort of represent those preferences in government?
Thanks. So I think on the methodology and kind of the generalizability of these findings, in terms of urban context within Punjab, I would venture, of course, there's no way to know for sure, given that our work is limited to Lahore, this particular work. But I would venture that the scope conditions would be fairly similar in some respects, right? So this is a dense urban context where there is strong competition between two major parties, right? And that ended up being true for a lot of major urban centers in Punjab in 2018, right? So to the extent that these two conditions kind of migrate, I would venture that these are kind of, fairly broad findings. In terms of kind of applicability to rural areas, I guess there's two considerations, right? Political ties may be a little bit closer in rural areas because of kind of more continuity, etc. But it's also the case that social hierarchies are perhaps stronger in rural areas, right? And so those social hierarchies may introduce their own kinds of biases. So there's no clear prediction that things would kind of be better or worse off in rural areas. On the more kind of prescriptive question of what lessons can politicians draw in terms of improving contact, I think there's some kind of like basic boring organizational improvements, and then there's some more structured improvements that are really hard to make, right? So on the boring organizational improvements, what we found kind of during a lot of our work is that political parties at the local level aren't very efficiently run organizations, right? They're very informal, record keeping, and kind of knowing who is responsible for what area, kind of regular keeping in contact with like how workers are performing, whether union council chairpersons are actually in their offices. All of these things are not being done in a very systematic way. And part of it is because kind of the local layer is disempowered in many important ways, right? So if it were the case that the local governments actually had a lot of funding, that there would be a lot of impetus from different tiers to try to make sure that the system is functioning in a better way. And there would also be more of an incentive for these local politicians to take their jobs more seriously than they are currently, which is not to say that a lot of these politicians are super invested in their localities, so they do kind of invest their time. So part of it is like, take these local political machineries as real organizations and run them like you would almost a business, in organizationally speaking. The second kind of more structural things are, some of these biases that we're talking about are just come from the environment. When you walk into Union Council office, you will see 15 men sitting about, a lot of informal conversations are happening. They're not very welcoming sometimes to women, in kind of a purely environmental sense. They also may not be very inviting to people who are not from the same social class sometimes. Certainly to minorities, right? So for instance, we have a minority representative in a union council, but we often see the minority representative kind of very marginalized and not very involved in a lot of conversations. That's one. And part of that is going to only come through kind of some of the representational challenges that Sarah talked about. What we do know is that when there is better information transmission from citizens to politicians are actually taking better decisions, right? So perhaps while we wait for some of these structural changes to happen, parties can think of kind of like sidestepping this and just getting more information in more systematic ways, right? So one simple way of getting, finding out what citizens want is to do better surveys. And parties have started to do that a little bit, but just to figure out what citizens want, you can have kind of better polls and surveys of that kind, and that can help politicians make better decisions.
Great, thanks so much, Asad, and those are some great prescriptive points to end our conversation here today as well. I'm afraid that's pretty much all the time that we have for today. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Mariam Mufti, Dr. Sarah Khan, Dr. Asad Liaqat, for taking the time out today to talk about their work and specifically to sort of share their research, which you can read more about in this edited volume, Pakistan's Political Parties, published by Folio Books here in Pakistan. I would urge that anyone who's interested in Pakistan's politics or simply just sort of wants to gain a better account, a descriptive account of what's happened within the political sphere in Pakistan over these preceding few decades, this is a great resource for that particular perspective as well. So that's pretty much it from our end. Thank you all once again for joining us. Thank you to the panelists for an enriching discussion and for sharing their research with us. And hopefully we'll see you very shortly again with more from the Political Economy of Development series that's been presented by the Mehboob ul Haq Research Center here at LUMS. Thank you so much.